Hey everybody, Nick here, and today I got a video for you about an element of being a reviewer that actually kind of surprised me, that I never thought about ahead of time, but has ended up being a major force in my collecting. And that topic for today's video is, what do all of these knives on, well, what is all this gear on the table, along with this on my wrist here, what do these have in common? So, being a reviewer is weird, right? I am a gear collector. One could probably argue I'm a gear hoarder, right? And that's a great thing. It brings me joy, and it's always brought me joy. And, at no point do I want this to feel like a complaint. But one of the things that I've realized more and more is that being a gear reviewer, and especially taking that a little bit seriously, which some would argue I take it much too seriously, but nonetheless, taking that seriously moves your collection in certain ways. Because, look, I have a personal collection, right? I show it off regularly. I talk about all of the pieces that are a part of my permanent collection, and they can be that way for many, many reasons, right? You can have pieces that are part of my collection because they are simply impressive. They show off something in terms of machining skill, there's something in terms of aesthetics, something that just makes me, every time I look at it, go like, wow, that's amazing. There are pieces that stick around for functional reasons. This is really the very best tool to do X, Y, or Z. Oh, really super thin, slicey blade I'm in love with. There were so many reasons why that might be a great approach, and why something like that could stick around. And even, frankly, there are ones that I have feelings about. And that's one of the joys of collecting, I think, is not the items themselves, but the things that they evoke. And there were no shortage of pieces in my collection that make me feel things. And not just like, oh, that's nice, but like that have actual associations with other humans, with parts of my life, etc. I'll do a video on that at some point in time. But there are lots of reasons things stick around, but all of these guys on the table stick around for one very specific reason. They may be amazing pieces, they may have a lot of joy to them, but they are a part of my collection still because they are good points of reference. This is a force that I battle with every single day as I am a reviewer, or as I am reviewing and as I'm looking at stuff that comes across my table. Because at some level it would be wonderful if I could just keep every piece that comes across my table. It would be amazingly expensive, blindingly expensive, but it would be really cool, right? Just have a library of pocket knives where I could always reach in and grab the one I'm looking for when I'm talking about in a review. But the thing is, that's not great. I mean, it would be great if I'm trying to recommend things to be like, oh, somebody says, hey, Nick, I want to do something like this. Well, this is the perfect choice, etc. Sure, that'd be cool, but I can't do that. So instead, what I've done is I've got my permanent collection of stuff that I'm very likely to carry on a day when I'm not going to carry anything for review. And then I've got these things around, which I think are very, very good points of comparison for a bunch of different reasons. For instance, one good example of this actually is the Reeve Sebenza. Now, I am very, very lucky that I can keep a knife like this around just for comparison purposes. And by the way, I'm not saying it's a bad knife or that I'd sell it instantly if I didn't have a channel, but I'm saying that this doesn't get as much pocket time as a lot of other things in my collection because, frankly, if I'm looking for a small frame lock, I've got a bunch of other options that also bring me joy. So the fact that, this guy slipping into the pocket relative to the, Sleech Bowie or something like that, probably a little less likely. But the fact is, the Sebenza is everybody's first grail in the high-end knife game. When people figure out that there is a knife community and they get into it immediately, generally it's kind of like the Rolex Submariner, right? Like everyone's like, oh, wow, I'm into watches, I should get a Rolex. I'm into knives, I should get a Sebenza. Because, it's an important factor there. And so it's important to have one of these guys around, not only because I think a lot of serious knife collectors have, at the very least, handled one of these guys or have thought about it, know things about them, whether it's in terms of smoothness, in terms of otherwise, or whether it's just, but it's important to have this around for reference. It's important to be able to make those comparisons directly, whether it's a size comparison, whether it's comparison of action, or whether it's just, as I'm talking about high-end gear, to have one on the table. There is an element to which that the legitimacy of your channel, and I don't want to make it sound like you need to have expensive knives to be a good reviewer, absolutely not. But there is an element to which, especially for people who are unfamiliar, having those points of comparison can make you seem a little bit more real as a collector. Although, mind you, I'm real as a collector, good God, that's the most pretentious sentence I've ever said. But nonetheless, the Sebenza is a good example of something like that. Another example of a good touchstone piece would actually be the 940 here. This is the Benchmade 940, and this is the original version. I've had other versions of the 940 on the channel before, and I, most notably a 940-2 that stuck around for a while, but this is sort of your base model 940. This was in many ways, actually, I can tell this story someday, this was in many ways the first high-end knife that I ever purchased, even though it's not this one particularly. But for a lot of people, this is, again, a point of reference. And any video that's talking about great EDC choices should probably at least mention the 940 as an option, because it absolutely is. One could argue that the Spyderco PM2 is the exact same way. The PM2 is not a knife that I'm liable to carry for myself. If I'm going to carry a big Spyderco, it's probably going to be the Shaman. I just like that piece a little bit better. But the PM2 remains a 500-pound gorilla in the world of what is the best EDC pocket knife. If that thread comes up, I guarantee you someone's going to talk about your paramilitary 2, your Sebenza, probably your 940, and a couple of other options that are out there. Right? It's going to be an important factor. And so having one of these guys around, there's a reason that this is one of my size comparison pieces. Because a lot of people end up with a PM2 in their collection. It's not so incredibly expensive that it's going to be prohibitive for some folks, which is why, for instance, the Sebenza isn't a size comparison piece. But it is going to be, and it's going to be a compelling choice for a bunch of different people. If I'm going to carry a Spyderco, maybe I do the Para 3 lightweight, or maybe I do the Shaman. But it's important to have one of these guys around, just because it represents, you know, kind of a major touchstone in the collection. There were a couple of other options here that offer other kinds of that. Some of them are very iconic, right? You know, the BitClick stick pen. This is not only great for size comparison, but it is a piece that pretty much everybody has handled, right? It's a piece that everybody knows about, and so when I put one of these down on the table, it's an instant point of reference for people. This is not what I would ever carry as an everyday carry pen. I mean, I'm sure I have carried them in the past, but that's usually because someone gave me one for free, and I need to find a place to put it. And so my pocket it goes. But still, this is not necessarily a piece that I would ever recommend, but it is still a piece that a bunch of people are familiar with. Same thing actually with the Fisher Space pen, the bullet pen. This is a touchstone for any kind of a bullet style pen, and there are lots of them. This is the Machine Era Classic, one of my very, very favorite pens. And I think there are a lot of similarities in terms of the overall style here with the Space pen. But it's important to have one of these guys around as you're talking about these kinds of things. Other things are actually more kind of category defining, have a little bit more history to them. The Buck 110 is an obvious case of this. When I first did my review, in a lot of ways, of the Buck 110, in a lot of ways, I feel like I failed to really engage with the history of the piece. This is a piece that is not really... Yes, it's a pocket knife, and yes, it's a fine pocket knife, right? There's a lot of benefit to it. There's also a lot of pain in the neck, but it is a piece. But more importantly, it is a culture. I think a number of knife people have probably just started laughing at that mere idea, but kind of is a thing, right? There is the archetypical, you know, Uncle Randy style. All I need is a Buck 110. You kids with your Sebenza. That is a whole affair. But the fact is, they've got something right there, and this has been, this is in many ways sort of the grandpappy of a lot of the modern knives that are on the table there. So it's very helpful to be able to bust out the 110 on occasion to talk about it, whether it's just to make fun of Uncle Randy, or whether it's to discuss kind of where pieces have diverged from this and what the 110 does bring to the table. This is a piece that, although it's not something I would really ever carry, it's one that I respect a great deal. And so it's one that I've come to respect more and more as I've spent more time in the hobby. But nonetheless, it's one of those that sticks around. Same thing with the Open L. Although, actually, this is such an inexpensive knife. These guys can be had for like $12 that I end up recommending it regularly. But it is also another one of those pieces where it's just like, this is a point of reference. I need to be able to talk about the Open L because I will regularly talk about the Open L. And so having one of these guys around, that's $10 of my life that I ain't getting back. But you know what? That's okay. And so it's definitely a good idea to have some of those around. There are other pieces that are not necessarily, that are just really good options, right? And one could argue that the 940 and the Para 2, they're really good options, but they're not as, I'm sorry, these guys are very iconic. But then we've got things like this. This is the Spyderco Chaparral Lightweight, and this is the Spyderco Native 5 Lightweight. Both the Native and the Chaparral are amazing pieces, and in fact, the Chaparral has gotten pocket time, and I can certainly see universes in which it gets more, but it doesn't get as much pocket time as some other things in my collection. You know, the TRM Neutron or something like that would probably kick this out of my pocket a lot of days. But the fact is, if somebody asks me for a pocket knife, I will regularly recommend the Native. I will regularly recommend the Chaparral, among other options, right? And so it's very helpful to have these kinds of things around to be able to talk about those. And so these are items that are not necessarily iconic in the sense of like the Open L, the Buck, the Sebenza, etc., but they are really solid choices, and it's very helpful if I'm talking about something to be able to demonstrate it. And luckily, these aren't so expensive that it makes makes no sense, or that it makes enough sense to have them around. Speaking of price is another thing that can make these guys easier to stick around. Budget knives is something a lot of folks, budget gear generally is something a lot of folks ask me about, right? And so I try to have things around that I recommend in the budget end. And again, on the budget end, it's a lot easier to have a collection of things that you might not carry as often. For instance, this is the Ontario Rat No. 1 pocket knife. This is in D2 steel. This is a great knife. It's a knife that I recommend all the damn time to people. And just because it is really, really good. It's way above its price point. It's really excellent. And so having one of these guys around is a no-brainer, because I can just whip it out in the middle of a live stream. That sounds wrong. I can whip out my Ontario Rat No. 1 pocket knife in the middle of a live stream and talk about it that way. And similarly, we've got other options in the budget realm from a bunch of other companies that I consider to be some of the best budget options. CJRB Centros. This is the Civivi Praxis. Another really great budget option. This is the CRKT Ruger LCK, which is one of the best budget pieces out there these days, although they're getting a little bit hard to find. The CRKT Pilar, whatever, is yet another really great budget-y friendly option. Even if it's not a knife that I would regularly carry, it's still a knife that is quite good. The Civivi Shredder is a very modern Civivi, but oh boy, the action. There's a lot of joy to this guy. And then the Ruwaiki Rake, was this the 801 or the 108? This is the 801. I always get those mixed up, right? But this is yet another piece that it's just like, it's very easy to recommend. It's very easy to send people to, and having it around makes that easier. On the watch front, actually, this is the Casio F108, which is one of the watches that is really, at some level, kind of... it's an oversimplification. This is a very, very simple watch, but at the same time, it has all the watchitude that anybody could possibly need, right? This does the job of watch beautifully for $15 or something like that. Or if you want to go up in style. Actually, I just bought this guy again recently. There's been a bout of discussion on my Patreon Discord about the Casio Royale, and it just made me remember that, you know what, this is a watch I should be recommending more often, because it is really great. It has some elements of style, although certainly not the style my... God, I just called him my fiance. Guys, it's been like 2 years. Anyways, I digress. That my wife is a fan of, but nonetheless, it has a certain style, and it is just a great recommendation for a relatively inexpensive everyday carry pocket watch, or a wristwatch. Could put it in your pocket, I guess. Then it would be a pocket watch. But nonetheless, this is definitely a... This is a piece that I recommend regularly and becomes a touchstone. And then finally, there were pieces, and actually the only one that came to mind immediately for me, although one could argue also that the Axis lock in the 940 provides this function, but there were pieces that demonstrate specific locking mechanisms. This is the Cold Steel Voyager. There is absolutely no reason that I would ever carry this pocket knife. It is a completely ridiculous knife, and it makes me laugh, which is yet another good reason to have it in my collection. But the Cold Steel Voyager XL here is a vaguely ridiculous knife, but it demonstrates both cold steel at its coldest and steeliest. Although one could argue that the Chris, hold on, where are you? The Cold Steel Chris Highlight is yet another good example of this, right? Yeah, this might be a little more cold steel still. But nonetheless, this Voyager guy has the advantage of demonstrating the triad lock, which is a type of back lock, which is perhaps even stronger than your average back lock. And so having that there is actually a joy. And it's something I can point to, and it's, you know, it's a demonstration of a locking mechanism that for some reason internet commenters are absolutely obsessed with. It's a good mechanism, but guys... Whoa. But anyways, so this is one of the weird things about being a reviewer, right? I'm a lucky man in that I can make these decisions. I can say, you know what, I might be able to sell this, but I should keep it around for the channel. I can say, you know what, I should have one of these guys. I should have one of these guys exactly so that I can talk about it and so I can reference it on the channel. And if I carry it, then great. But otherwise, it doesn't need to be a thing. You know, I talk often about I try not to have safe queens. I try not to have knives that I would never carry in my collection, because then your collection just grows and grows and grows. But these are cases where I'm willing to kind of eschew that, where I'm willing to have pieces around that are maybe not something I would carry on a regular basis, or really would carry ever in some cases, but still bring something compelling to the table for the channel. One other thing to talk about, though, is that this makes it very easy to become a hoarder, right? One could argue I'm already there. I mean, at this point in time, I could probably carry a different knife every day for 2 months, and if we get into gas station knives, about 2 years. But nonetheless, I could carry a different knife every day and still be fine, which is why I demand a very, very strong steel that requires sharpening roughly never, because Anyways, I digress. Pete over at Cedric and Ada Gear and Outdoors made a nice point about that the other day. But look, at some level, it makes it very easy for me to just hang on to something great. The most recent example of this was the Spyderco Canis, or Canis, I don't know how it's pronounced. But anyways, this is a brand new knife from them, and it is a great knife from them. It is absolutely wonderful. It's not a knife that I ever expected to like, but it is a very, very nice everyday carry choice. And I found myself thinking to myself, should I be keeping this? Should I be talking about keeping this around for reference on the channel? And I ended up settling on no, just because that's dangerous precedent, right? If I keep every gem, then, oh my God, is my collection going to get huge and expensive? And, whew. So, but it's something that I fight every time I really fall in love with a piece of gear. Like, I want to keep all the great stuff around, but I can't necessarily afford to, both in terms of time and in terms of space, and in terms of I want to be generous. I want to, move things along, and if I can do that for charitable reasons, all the better. But anyways, there you go. So this is just kind of one of the weird parts about being a gear reviewer, is you end up having this part of your collection that may not actually be for you anymore, but is still valuable and is still useful and serves a very important role in what you, well, maybe not very important, but an important role in what you end up doing. And sometimes you end up buying pieces that you wouldn't necessarily end up having on your wrist on a daily basis, but end up, or in your pocket on a daily basis, but still end up being necessary for you. So anyways, hope this is interesting to you, and have yourselves just an absolutely wonderful rest of your day. Bye now.